The Graveyard of Empires. The mythological status of Afghanistan being a place where empires meet their fate is well rooted in history. At the height of their imperial glory, the British got their fingers burnt by the resilient and rugged Afghans during the course of the Anglo-Afghan Wars. But perhaps a better and more relevant example was showcased during the 1980s, when the Soviet Union invaded the mountainous country, in the process triggering a tenacious resistance from the Afghan people that captured the imagination of the world. The guerrilla warfare initiated by the Mujahideen forced the Soviet military machine to be stretched to its limits. And the consequences of the war would prove instrumental in shaping geopolitics up until today. In this feature-length documentary, I'll not only explore the war itself, but trace the causes of it too, going as far back as the modernizing initiatives of the 1950s. In the process, we'll be able to understand important questions such as, how did this conservative and staunchly Islamic society come to be governed by an atheistic inclined ideology like communism in 1978? And how did an irregular group of guerrilla warriors like the Mujahideen contend with a military superpower like the Soviet Union? In the years after World War II, the Afghan political elite decided on a course of rapid economic and political change to its society. This course was taken as a matter of necessity rather than ideological conviction. The country's monarchic political order was conservative, but understood that in order to survive in a modern world, they had to modernize. At the same time, these changes have to be understood within the wider scope of contemporary international affairs. The Cold War between the United States of America and the Soviet Union was the most important geopolitical issue from the end of World War II in 1945 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this time period, the two superpowers used both soft and hard power to persuade nations to be aligned with them. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Afghanistan's monarchical government took advantage of this precarious situation by essentially playing off the two superpowers against each other in a bid to get more developmental aid. Both the Americans and the Soviets promised the Afghans help in modernizing projects. For instance, the USA built a dam in Helmand during the 1950s and 60s, which aimed to instrumentalize the Helmand River's capacity to generate energy. Whilst the Soviets in 1955 rolled out $100 million in credit that would facilitate Soviet engineers to construct factories, dams, airports, and highways. Another aspect of the Afghan government's desire to modernize was to send young university students out to countries like the Soviet Union and America to gain knowledge that the students could then bring back and use for the progress of Afghanistan. Herein lays a key causal effect of the eventual Soviet-Afghan War. After World War II, there were certain strands of Afghan society, especially within the university students and army officers, who were familiarizing themselves with divergent strands of ideological thought, such as liberalism and communism. The communist students and army officers who traveled abroad to the Soviet Union for training would foment greater ties with the communist superpower, and in time, these close ties would serve them once the communists gained power inside Afghanistan. In addition, in 1965, Nur Muhammad Tarakay, along with Babrak Karmal and others, set up the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, a Marxist-Leninist political party that presented their political outlook within the framework of a class struggle. The PDPA soon fractured into two main factions, Khalq being the more radical one, and Parcham being known as the more moderate of the two. It should be mentioned that these political developments took place within the backdrop of what's known as the Constitutional Decade, a period lasting from 1964 to 1973 that was characterized by a move towards democracy. Whilst it brought about a multi-party system and a free press, the Constitutional Decade brought its fair share of political chaos as well. This, coupled with ecological disasters, forced the scholar Louis Dupuy to prophetically state in 1971 that revolution would seem no more than a decade away. Within 5 years, the first abortive coup may occur. Most likely, it will emanate from the idealistic, unrealistic left. In 1973, whilst the king, Zahir Shah, was away on medical treatment in Italy, his cousin and ex-prime minister, Muhammad Dawood Khan, staged the bloodless coup that toppled the monarchy and replaced it with a republic that had him at its helm. In doing this, he was helped by the communist PDPA and their Soviet-trained military officers who had infiltrated the government and army. This alliance was viewed very negatively by the increasingly outspoken Islamist activists who were ideologically antagonistic to communism. In addition to this, Dawood Khan reignited a rivalry with Pakistan that was largely focused on his irredentist desires to reclaim territories lost to the British in 1893, which was subsequently inherited by Pakistan upon its creation in 1947. These territories within Pakistan were inhabited by the Pashtun ethnic group, the dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan politically and demographically. In response to President Dawood's subversive activities within Pakistan, the ISI, the Secret Service of Pakistan, began to give funding and training to prominent Islamists such as Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and Burhanuddin Rabbani in their anti-government activities. This materialized into an Islamist uprising in 1975 that was put down by the Afghan government. In time, Dawood's coalition with the communists disintegrated, to devastating consequences. In 1977, he proclaimed a new constitution and called a new cabinet which was devoid of appointments for members of the two factions of the PDPA, Khalq and Parcham. In fact, he actively sought out to minimize the influence of communist members that had helped him in his 1973 coup. Dawood had even made attempts to reconcile himself with certain Islamic fundamentalist leaders, but the Khalqis and Parchamis had a solid power base amongst army officers and had helped their cause by unifying the two factions in 1977. By 1978, Dawood had left himself in a position where he had no power base and was opposed by a wide array of forces that ranged from Islamic fundamentalists to liberal university students. This provided the perfect opportunity for the communists to overthrow him. And so in April 1978, the PDPA launched the Saur Revolution, in which Dawood, along with his family, lost their lives, and a communist state was established in Afghanistan. The PDPA, under the leadership of the Khalqist Nur Muhammad Tarakay, immediately set about to bring widespread changes to Afghan society. These changes, such as land reforms and the emancipation of women, were intended to rapidly modernize Afghan society, something which other Afghan rulers had tried to do in the 20th century, such as King Amanullah in the 1920s. But the PDPA went even further, attacking practices and traditions which they viewed as feudal. This antagonistic approach to certain elements of tradition was extended to Islam as well. The PDPA's outlook seemed to be rooted in a desire to vindicate the famous Marxist statement, "Religion is the opium of the masses." The socio-cultural makeup of Afghanistan meant that the new leadership was on a collision course with the majority of its citizens. Ordinary Afghans resented and resisted what they viewed as a forced attempt to change their identity, especially since it required them to sever connections with the most important element of their culture, Islam. Throughout the countryside, more and more families were migrating to Iran and Pakistan, whilst an Islamist rebel movement in the form of the Mujahideen was growing in strength, undoubtedly helped by the significant number of defecting army soldiers. The Mujahideen meant those who engage in jihad, or holy struggle, and they portrayed themselves as being the opponents of the quote-unquote un-Islamic communists. The general discontent with the PDPA only served to fuel the cause of the Mujahideen. There were several spontaneous uprisings around the country, the most famous of which took place in the city of Herat in March 1979, where a popular uprising with the support of mutinying army soldiers took control of one of the most important cities in the country. The communist government's response was ruthless. Thousands were killed as they reclaimed control over the city. The rising strength of anti-government forces, as well as the bad decisions made by the PDPA, worried the Soviet Union, the key ally of the Afghan communists. In September 1979, there was a power struggle within the Khalq faction, and President Tarakay was removed from power and later executed by his successor, Hafizullah Amin. Amin was far more defiant and independently minded than Tarakay was. Whilst he was a committed communist, the new leader was more interested in putting Afghan sovereignty first and foremost. To the horror of the Soviets, Amin seemed to have even been trying to improve relations with the Americans. As a result, his relationship with the USSR was rapidly deteriorating. By December, the Soviets had to make a decision to get directly involved and stabilize the situation in favor of their allies, or risk letting the communist government collapse. It should be stated that the Soviets did not want to intervene directly in Afghanistan. They demonstrated that repeatedly throughout 1978 and 1979, when even though the PDPA asked for direct military help, the Soviets refused. The two sides had actually signed a friendship treaty in December 1978, which allowed the Afghan communist government to call on the Soviets for military help. But Afghanistan was not of major international importance to the USSR, and it was obvious that the conservative country would be hostile to their military presence. What ended up changing their mind is not known for sure. One can only speculate. The Iranian Revolution that had happened earlier in 1979 would justifiably have given the Soviet leadership cause for concern for their own internal stability. The Soviet Union had a number of Muslim republics in Central Asia under its control at the time. Therefore, an Islamist Iranian revolution in conjunction with a rising Islamist movement in Afghanistan under the Mujahideen would not have boded well for the peace of mind of Soviet policymakers. In this time, the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, had been suffering from a variety of ailments, meaning that by the late 1970s, He was helped significantly by the trio of Yuri Andropov, Dmitry Ustinov, and Andrei Gromyko. In December 1979, the Soviet leadership decided upon a short intervention in Afghanistan that would stabilize the government, partly by replacing President Amin with the more moderate Parchami Babrak Karmal. A key failure of the Soviets in their decision-making process was in the way that they viewed Afghanistan. To the Soviet higher-ups, Afghanistan was only seen in the context of the Cold War. This meant that they largely viewed the Mujahideen uprising against the PDPA as being something that was stoked and sponsored by their Cold War rivals, the Americans. This strategic lack of insight would prove fatal for the Soviets, as they failed to understand that the majority of Afghans were actually against the ideas and policies of the PDPA. And it was this, not American encouragement, that gave rise to the Mujahideen. Bearing this in mind will help us understand why Afghanistan is referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1979, Soviet forces started moving into the country under the pretext of a pre-existing friendship treaty. They quickly pinpointed key centers of telecommunication with the aim of disabling the communications network, so that the Soviets could take hold of the capital Kabul and carry out Operation Storm 333 3 days later. This was the name given to the operation under which President Amin was assassinated by Soviet Special Forces, aka the Spetsnaz, in the Tajbek Palace. The daring operation was a remarkable success, carried out in just 40 minutes. The very next day, the Soviets brought in Babrak Karmal, perceived to be a more moderate communist, as Afghanistan's new president. By the beginning of 1980, approximately 80,000 Soviet troops had poured into the country through 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor. Their instructions were to take control of the major urban centers and highways inside the country. The reaction of the international community was largely unanimous.
No words, therefore, which I shall say today can fully convey the deep sense of disappointment and disillusion which the government and people of Nigeria felt when they heard the news of Soviet armed intervention in Afghanistan, a third world developing non-aligned country which posed no immediate threat to the peace and security of the Soviet Union.
Most of the Islamic world strongly condemned the Soviet actions.
Actually, the Soviet invasion does not represent anything but imperialist expansion, aimed at establishing and consolidating a communist rule against the will of the peaceful Muslim Afghan people.
Whilst the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution protesting against the Soviet invasion by a vote of 104 to 18. The Soviets stated that it was a legitimate intervention since they were obliging aid requested by the official Afghan government. However, the international community was not convinced by this. Why would President Amin invite the Soviets in to kill him and topple his government? The reaction of the Afghan people was similarly unanimous. The Soviet military's presence did not have the desired effect the Bolshevik High Command was seeking. Instead of bringing security and stability, it invoked a deep-seated hostility to the idea of a foreign invasion within the Afghans. The British had had first-hand experience with the patriotic fervour of the Afghans during the 19th century. Now that Islam was also under attack, in the eyes of the Muslim population, there was no way that the Soviets could have the early withdrawal that they wanted. The unpopularity of this war amongst the Afghans served as the perfect recruitment tool for the Mujahideen groups, the most prominent of which established their headquarters across the border in Pakistan. Throughout the course of the war, roughly 6 million Afghans were forced to flee the country. That's around a third of the entire country. In fact, there are some that estimate that half of the world's refugees in the 1980s were Afghan, with more than 3 million moving to Pakistan, whilst around 2 million fled to Iran. These refugee camps, especially the ones in Pakistan, served as focal centres of recruitment for the cause of jihad. It should be specified that this migration was not merely an ideological reaction to the infidel Soviets. Rather, a significant amount of it was due to Soviet military tactics and practices. Initially, the situation was characterized by the Soviets being content with their enclave strategy. That is, they were committed to defending major cities and roads, whilst avoiding large-scale pacification campaigns in the countryside, which was largely controlled by the Mujahideen. But soon after, the Soviets started to favor more of an aggressive policy that went hand in hand with President Karmal's calls in 1982 for a campaign called From City to Village, which would try to extend communist control from the provincial centres out to the rural areas. Naturally, this led to an intensification of conflict. The Soviets would attack villages that they suspected of harbouring the Mujahideen. A lot of the times, the villagers were unfortunate that the Mujahideen attacked a Soviet convoy near their village, which subsequently led to Soviet reprisal attacks on civilians. According to the eminent Afghan historian Muhammad Hassan Kakar, the Afghans were the victims of a deliberate attempt at genocide. He states, "The claim of the Soviet Union that it dispatched its limited contingent to repulse foreign aggression proved groundless after the uprising of February 1980, when its war machine began to kill not only the Mujahideen, but also defenseless civilians throughout the country." Frustrated by the tough resistance and their inability to suppress it expeditiously, the Soviets embarked on a program of genocide. Whilst this statement may seem exaggerated, there was certainly a conscious effort on the Soviet leadership's part to intimidate the countryside into submission. This included indiscriminate massacres, rape, forced depopulation, the destruction of crops and irrigation, leaving millions of mines scattered across the country, some of them being booby traps disguised as children's toys. In conjunction with this, the communist Afghan secret police, Khad, was also especially feared and despised throughout the country. Rather than breaking the morale of the Afghan people and Mujahideen, these heavy-handed tactics only served to reinforce their stubborn resistance. Even though the rugged and determined nature of the Mujahideen would prove to be the bedrock of the Afghan path to victory, it is impossible to undermine the importance of the role played by foreign countries in supporting their efforts. Within the Afghan resistance, the Americans saw an opportunity to undermine their Cold War rivals. And so began Operation Cyclone, one of the biggest and longest covert CIA operations ever, where America sent financial aid to the Mujahideen. To shed more light on this, we now go to Cypher from Cynical Historian.
The United States and the rest of NATO immediately protested the Soviet invasion. 65 countries boycotted the 1980 Olympics, including Communist China and Albania. The Warsaw Pact returned the favor by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. President Jimmy Carter, in a startling flash of decisive action for once, began funneling funds to the Mujahideen, starting with $30 million. By 1987, that number rose to $630 million. American policymakers, like CIA Chief William Casey and Congressman Charlie Wilson, lobbied for this increase, which newly elected President Ronald Reagan was all too happy to authorize. Reagan was a Cold Warrior and used the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan to turn funding from welfare programs to the military in order to fight what he called the evil empire. During the 1985 State of the Union address, he said,
"We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth. Support for freedom fighters is self-defense."
This was the Reagan Doctrine, and it dictated U.S. support of the Mujahideen.
It should be mentioned that the Americans were extremely careful and measured in extending their military support to the Mujahideen. The idea of Afghanistan becoming the USSR's Vietnam was not so enthusiastically embraced by the American political machine at the beginning of the conflict. And for good reason. For starters, unlike America and Vietnam, the Soviet Union actually shared a border with the Afghans, thus reducing potential logistical issues. Also, the Soviets, along with their Russian Empire predecessors, had a rich history of invasions, giving them an advantage in expertise. And lastly, the issue of human casualties in a war was not a regime-shaking matter for the authoritarian Bolsheviks. So for the first few years of the war, the Americans were cautious about leaving their footprint in Afghanistan, fearing that if the resistance fails, it would become another blow to them, which would mean that the Vietnam Syndrome, the American public's aversion to involvement in overseas conflicts, would not only not heal, but it would actually get even worse. Therefore, the more the Afghan resistance endured and strengthened, the more the USA would increase their military assistance. American aid was funneled to the Mujahideen through the conduit of the ISI, the Pakistani Secret Service. The Pakistani government, under the military general, President Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, threw its full weight of support behind the Afghan resistance, accommodating the millions of refugees and providing training camps for the Mujahideen. General Zia skillfully used the Afghan issue for his own political ambition by gripping on to absolute power for 10 years. At the same time, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan served Zia's national interests as well, since it deflected attention away from the nuclear program which Pakistan was actively pursuing. Saudi Arabia was another major contributor to the Mujahideen cause. Officially, they stated that they would match the USA's financial aid. Iran played a key role in helping the Shia Mujahideen factions, especially from the Hazara ethnic group. The Communist government of China was also involved in aiding the Mujahideen against their fellow communist rivals, the Soviets. Interestingly, what is often downplayed is the role played by private donations. Journalist Jason Burke references an interview with the head of the ISI during the war, Hamid Gul, and states that as little as 25% of the money for the Afghan jihad was actually supplied directly by states. The resolve of the Mujahideen and the foreign aid combined to create a clinical and effective force that the Soviets and their Afghan communist allies could not contain. The Mujahideen ensured that this would be an Afghan-style war, one which saw the tough mountainous terrain of the country being used to produce a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. It is tough to know for sure their true strength of numbers, but it is estimated that the Mujahideen had up to 250,000 fighters. They specialized in hit-and-run tactics, as well as ambushing convoys. Whilst they started out with the outdated Enfield rifles, the Afghan Mujahideen moved on to the now iconic AK-47 Kalashnikovs as their favored weapon. A particularly menacing foe for them was the Soviet gunships, such as the Mi-24 Hind gunships that were used in search and destroy operations. This issue was tackled by the Americans, who in 1986 started supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, which were heat-seeking missiles that were shot at Soviet gunships. Some analysts viewed the introduction of these surface-to-air missiles as a game-changer, going on to coin the term the Stinger effect, although their effectiveness is debated by others. Whilst on the ground, the Mujahideen had operational agency to determine their best course of action within their small groups, the wider movement did have political leaders that formed their own parties which the Mujahideen would then affiliate themselves with. The Pakistani-based Peshawar 7 was by far the most important group of parties in the war effort. They were supported by America, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Pakistan. The most prominent party of the Peshawar 7 was the Hizb-e Islami, an Islamist group led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This group received the lion's share of the aid from America, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But the group's leader, Hekmatyar, has received intense criticism throughout the years for being an extremist that was more focused on enlarging his own influence than the cause of defeating the Soviets. According to CIA officer Graham Fuller, he spent a lot more of his time fighting other Mujahideen than killing Soviets. He has been accused on numerous occasions of ordering assassinations and attacks on other Mujahideen factions during the war. In this regard, Hekmatyar is often juxtaposed with Ahmad Shah Massoud, a commander for the Jamiyat-e-Islami party. The charismatic Massoud was lionized by the Western media for his tactical brilliance in guerrilla warfare as the Lion of Panjshir. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial about Massoud in 1992 titled "The Afghan Who Won the Cold War." But Massoud's track record seems to be as murky as Hekmatyar's. Throughout the war, Massoud was criticized by other Mujahideen parties for making deals with the Soviets. In 1983, he signed a year-long truce with the Soviets where he agreed to not attack Soviet convoys on their way through the pivotal Salang Tunnel from Soviet Central Asia to Kabul. It is tough to understate the importance of the Salang Tunnel for the Soviets. According to General Gromov, the commander of the Soviet 40th Army in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah could have turned Salang into a Russian graveyard just by throwing rocks. His supporters claimed that he intended to use this time to rebuild his forces and give the war-weary inhabitants of the Panjshir Valley, where he himself was from, a break from the constant major Soviet campaigns in the area. But to his Afghan critics, that doesn't change the fact that Soviet forces could now focus on implementing their harsh and ruthless tactics on Massoud's fellow countrymen and women in other parts of the country. In spite of all this focus on specific leaders, it should not lead us to romanticize their roles. Whereas in reality, the Afghan Jihad was too big, too complicated, and had too many major actors for it to be boiled down and essentialized in the manner that Western journalists often portrayed it to be. Massoud's ceasefire with the Soviets is a perfect example of this sloppy portrayal, as well as the multifaceted nuances of the Afghan resistance. How can a man who had a ceasefire with the enemy be regarded as a leader of the resistance? In 1985, the reformist Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the USSR, and the Soviet need to exit Afghanistan gained fresh impetus. In preparation for their withdrawal, the Soviets gave greater responsibility to the Afghan Communist government. In 1986, they replaced President Karmal with Muhammad Najibullah, the former head of the Afghan Secret Service. President Najibullah was clearly given instructions to take a policy of rapprochement with the opposition that would bring an end to hostilities. A program of national reconciliation was put forward, and in 1987 a new constitution was ratified, which amongst other things showed a greater role for Islam in the political outlook of the Afghan Communist government. Already severely weakened by thousands of soldiers defecting every year, the Afghan Communist government welcomed the idea of a power-sharing scenario with the Mujahideen. But the notion of making peace with a weak puppet communist regime that was ideologically antagonistic to Islam was not enticing for the Mujahideen leadership. Regardless, Gorbachev had to find a way to withdraw from Afghanistan, which he described as a bleeding wound. Finally, in April 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed by Afghanistan, USSR, Pakistan, and America, securing the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the country. The Mujahideen leadership, however, was furious that they were left out of the Geneva talks. By February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldiers had left Afghanistan. They had lost around 15,000 soldiers in the conflict. But the war took an especially heavy toll on Afghanistan. More than 9 years of fighting had left anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million Afghans dead. A third of the population was forced to flee the country, whilst there were more than 1 million Afghans displaced within the country. More than 2 million Afghans were left wounded, a number that was guaranteed to increase even after the Soviets pulled out, because they had left more than 10 million unexploded mines scattered throughout the country. If we consider that Afghanistan had a reported population of about 15 million before the war, we can see that the Afghan-Soviet war subjected most of the nation to becoming a casualty of some form. As for the future of the country, the words of a Soviet captain who served in Afghanistan would prove fateful. Children born in Afghanistan at the start of the war have been brought up in war conditions. This is their way of life. The aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal did not bring an end to war and conflict. In fact, it led to a number of key developments around the world. The USSR, already in the throes of a permanent decline, would collapse within 2 years, and all of its constituent member states would gain independence. As for the Americans, their interest in Afghanistan declined considerably now that their main strategic goal of dealing a blow to their Soviet counterparts was achieved. But it should be noted that up until the fall of the Afghan Communist government in 1992, the USA still sent hundreds of millions of dollars in aid money to the Mujahideen. Globally, it is hard to understate the importance of the Afghan-Soviet war to the prominence of militant Islamic fundamentalism that would come to define the 2000s. The most famous example of the link between the two was Osama bin Laden, and how the roots of his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, can be traced back to the battlefields of Afghanistan, where he fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviet and Afghan communists. But for more on the war on terror and how it developed, definitely check out Cynical Historian's video, which is dedicated purely to that topic. As for the Afghans, their woes and anguish were not over. It took 3 years of hard fighting for the Mujahideen to finally bring down the Afghan Communist government in 1992. Then, the world watched in horror as the Mujahideen groups immediately turned on each other and initiated a bitter 4-year-long civil war that saw the destruction of the capital, Kabul. And it was only brought to an end in 1996 by the emergence of the Taliban. 41 years after war began in Afghanistan, the country is still in a state of warfare today. As usual, I want to thank my patrons for their generous support. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Don't forget to check out Cynical Historian's video on the global war on terror. Until next time, peace!